Tonight the halls of Versailles glitter as they always did, with chandeliers blazing like trapped constellations above 1,000 polished mirrors. But beneath that proud surface there is a quiet truth. No courtier dares speak aloud. A truth that starts in a place so small and shameful that even the king who commanded armies and continents could barely admit it existed. Louis the 14th, the man who shaped France for more than 7 decades. The man who carried the title of the Sun King as casually as other men carried their cloaks, would not be brought down by a rival nation, or a failed war, or a treacherous noble, but by a wound hidden between layers of silk and brocade. A wound that began as a sting, then a burn, then an infection, and finally an agony that hollowed him out from the inside until the king of the most powerful monarchy in Europe was left unable to sit, unable to sleep, unable to breathe without tasting pain. It began almost innocently, a discomfort he dismissed, because men like him were not supposed to fear anything that grew out of their own bodies. But that first spark of pain would eventually expand into the dark corridor that led him to his final breath on the first day of September of the year 1715. The day France watched a living god collapse under the weight of something no bigger than a fingertip. Louis had been born in the year 1638, ascending the throne in the year 1643 when he was only 5 years old. And from the moment the crown hovered above his head, he grew into a creature made of certainty, a man who understood that France moved when he moved, breathed because he breathed, existed exactly as he commanded it to. Versailles itself stood as proof of his hunger for control, a palace of gold not built for comfort or beauty alone, but crafted to trap the nobility inside a glittering maze, where every bow and every whisper reminded them that Louis the 14th was the center of the universe. He stood taller than life, draped in velvet and authority, worshipped almost like a deity in an age when kings claimed their right to rule from heaven. But the thing no one tells you about gods is how fragile their skin really is, how soft their bodies truly remain beneath all the symbols carved to make them seem eternal. And the Sun King would learn that lesson alone, in the dark, clutching his bed covers while the court continued dancing as if the world had not started rotting under the feet of their monarch. The infection that would devour him began with the faintest throb, a pulse of heat in the flesh that no man discusses politely. And Louis tried to ignore it, because kings were not meant to fear something they could not see. Yet the pain grew. It lingered in his steps, crawled under his robes during ceremonies, whispered reminders during long councils that even he was made of blood and bone and vulnerable tissue. At first he hid it from the court, from his physicians, even from himself, insisting that nothing so trivial could disturb the man who had survived wars, rebellions, and the constant weight of ruling millions of souls. But the body does not kneel to titles. The body does not care if you sit on a throne or in the dirt. His flesh swelled. The throbbing intensified. And the small tear became a tunnel of infection. Soon the Sun King, the monarch who had commanded the architecture of Europe, found himself standing through his audiences, not because he preferred the view, but because sitting had become its own private torture. A sharp reminder every moment of every day that something inside him was going wrong. By the time his physicians finally inspected him, they carried in their expressions of fear they tried to disguise with the dignity of their profession. They lived in an age before antibiotics, before anesthesia, before any of the tools that might have saved him. And what they found in their sovereign's body was a nightmare of swelling, pus, and torn flesh that left them helpless. The infection had begun as a minor abscess, but it deepened into what modern medicine calls a fistula, a track burrowing inward from the skin toward the interior canal, a place no sunshine ever touched, a place where filth and bacteria festered unchecked. And yet Louis still tried to act like a king, insisted on performing ceremonies, forced his voice steady, even as sweat trickled down his spine from the intensity of the pain. But pain has a way of eating away the walls we build around ourselves. It strips away dignity first, then strength, then the illusion that we control anything at all. Even as Louis demanded that life at Versailles continue with its parties, its etiquette, its humiliating rituals of court attendance, his private world had already begun crumbling. Each hour bringing a new wave of fire to the wound, growing at the core of his suffering. The irony ran so deep it became almost poetic. The king, who had forced the nobility to live under his watchful gaze, now found himself shrinking from the eyes of his own attendants. The man who had commanded that France revolve around him now found that the infection inside his body would not obey a single royal decree. It spread, slowly at first, then violently, pushing inflammation deeper, poisoning his blood, weakening his muscles, and turning the palace that symbolized his power into the stage upon which his frailty was exposed. His doctors tried everything the 17th century allowed: herbs, poultices, incisions, cauterization, prayers whispered in the dark after failed procedures, but nothing stopped the infection's march. Louis, the man who had shaped French culture, transformed government, rebuilt Europe's understanding of monarchy, now lay awake at night, feeling the pulse of his wound, as if the infection had learned how to speak through pain. The tragedy of his decline is not only that he suffered, but that he suffered in silence, trapped in a world where even kings were not allowed to admit fear. And while the court around him continued to sparkle, the real Versailles, the Versailles that existed behind the doors of his bedchamber, grew heavy with the smell of decay and the quiet panic of servants who realized their immortal Sun King was fading. The infection gnawed at him until the day he could no longer hide the truth. The day he became an old man clutching a dying body, rather than a god directing a nation. His death on the first day of September of the year 1715 marked not only the end of his reign, but the beginning of the unraveling of the monarchy he had spent a lifetime shaping into an instrument of absolute power. And that is where this story truly begins, because when a king like Louis the XIV falls, he does not fall alone, and the wound that killed him did far more than pierce his flesh. It pierced the future of France. Louis the XIV had spent a lifetime mastering the art of appearing unbreakable. Yet as autumn settled over Versailles, the king began noticing something new in the rhythm of his days. A subtle shifting of weight inside his body that made each moment feel slightly out of alignment. And although he kept up his rituals with the stiffness of a man unwilling to surrender even an inch of his dignity, there were cracks beginning to open beneath the surface. The corridors still glittered with golden molding and long polished floors. But each morning he woke earlier than the sun itself, lying still with his palms pressed against the sheets, trying to measure the depth of the pain that waited for him the moment he tried to sit upright. And in those quiet minutes, no amount of royal pride could silence the truth that rose inside him like a slow tide. He was beginning to dread the simple act of moving. The infection that had started as a bruise of discomfort had now grown into a presence that lived inside him, pulsing in time with his heartbeat, branding each gesture with a reminder that something beneath his skin was turning dangerous. He hid it the way powerful men hide the things they cannot control, through routine, through ceremony, through the illusion that the world remained unchanged. But his body rebelled against each gesture, and the people closest to him began noticing how he lowered himself onto a chair with the deliberateness of a man who feared the sudden shock of pain, how his eyes tightened for the briefest second when he believed no one watched, how his breath sometimes caught before he even had the chance to speak. The court, always alert to shifts in the king's energy, pretended not to notice, because to notice was to admit weakness, and weakness was something Versailles had never allowed itself to witness without consequence. Still, whispers began slipping between lace cuffs and powdered wigs, because nothing in the palace remained hidden forever, and certainly not the quiet suffering of a man who had once seemed larger than the architecture he lived inside. The palace continued its rituals, the endless ballet of courtiers presenting themselves before the king, the exhausting etiquette that required the nobility to orbit him like planets caught in an eternal loop. But Louis felt detached from it like a man watching his own life from behind a pane of glass. The infection carved deeper, not only into his flesh, but into his confidence, altering the way his mind processed the world. The meals that once brought him enjoyment now felt like burdens he had to endure, his appetite thinning into something fragile. And although chefs prepared platters with the same elaborate richness as always, the king began pushing food across his plate without tasting it, pretending fullness whenever his attendants glanced toward him in silent worry. He slept less each night, not because he wanted to, but because lying still required him to find a position that did not send lightning through his lower spine. And each time he did drift into sleep, the pain woke him again. Slicing the darkness open, he began spending more time alone, dismissing attendants earlier than before, allowing only a handful of trusted servants to help him dress. And even they noticed that the king no longer rose with the same commanding presence. Instead, he moved with something close to caution, as if he feared that one wrong step might pull apart the fragile balance inside his body. The infection had begun altering the temperature of his skin, sometimes burning with fever, other times cold and clammy, leaving him struggling to hide the trembling in his hands when he raised a cup or signed a document. Physicians observed these changes with the anxious restraint of men terrified of disappointing their sovereign, because they knew what they were dealing with, and they knew how helpless 17th century medicine was in the face of such a condition. Yet Louis refused to let them near him for longer than necessary, insisting on his strength, insisting he needed only rest, insisting that kings did not fall to such trivial things. But the body does not listen to authority, and every hour brought new discomfort. The infection burrowed inward, building pockets of pressure that made him grit his teeth during council meetings. He began shifting his weight from one foot to the other, standing for longer periods because sitting had become an agony he could no longer mask. And although courtiers maintained their elegant composure, their eyes betrayed the unease growing between them. They could sense the imbalance forming around the king, an imbalance that threatened the system of control Louis had spent his life constructing. And as the infection progressed, it introduced a new humiliation into his daily existence, something no one at Versailles dared mention, but everyone quietly recognized there were moments when his clothes needed to be changed more often, when the scent of illness slipped into the air, despite the perfumes that clouded every corner of the palace. Servants cleaned obsessively, but sickness has a way of leaking beyond walls. Louis felt it too. He wasn't blind to the shame of it. During long nights, he lay awake, staring at the carved canopy above his bed, hearing the echoes of battles he had won, the applause of crowds, the deep vibrato of ceremonial music, and wondered how a life carved from power could be threatened by something so small and so hidden. He had lived through wars that shaped Europe's borders, through rebellions that tested the monarchy's foundation, and through decades of diplomatic games that required sharp instinct and unwavering resolve. Yet none of those trials compared to the slow, grinding embarrassment of feeling his body betray him. In those hours he experienced something he had not felt since childhood, a vulnerability so profound it unsettled him, because kings were not meant to question their durability. And here he was, clutching the edge of his mattress, trying to breathe through a pain no one else could carry for him. The infection reshaped his days into a constant cycle of bracing for pain, enduring pain, recovering from pain, and pretending none of it existed. His physicians attempted treatments, incisions, poultices, things he endured only because the alternative was worse. But each procedure left him drained and hollow. He began excusing himself from certain rituals, which sent ripples through the palace, because the king's absence from even the smallest ceremony carried political weight. France depended on his presence, on the performance of monarchy, on the illusion that he remained an unshakable sun at the center of everything. And each withdrawn appearance weakened the structure he had built around himself. Ministers adjusted meetings. Courtiers rearranged their schedules. Ambassadors waited days longer than expected, all because the king needed moments to gather himself before facing the world with a mask he was struggling to hold in place. Meanwhile, the infection deepened in ways he could feel but not see. Sometimes the pain radiated into his legs, making them heavy. Sometimes it pressed upward like a fist against his abdomen, distorting his sense of balance. There were mornings when he rose and had to grip the bedpost before taking a single step, the dizziness swirling around him like a storm he couldn't steady. Still, he pushed forward, because to stop would be to admit defeat. And Louis the XIV had never been a man who acknowledged defeat. The courtiers continued bowing. The musicians continued playing. The palace continued shining. But in the quiet spaces between his breaths, Louis began sensing a horizon he had never imagined he would face. A horizon not shaped by armies or politics, but by his own fragile flesh. And as the days lengthened into a slow, grinding winter, the infection became less a symptom and more a companion. A dark presence walking beside him, whispering with every movement that kings might command countries, but they do not command their blood. It was in those weeks that Louis first understood, quietly and without admitting it even to himself, that the life he had held together through sheer force of will was beginning to slip. Not because of enemies outside his walls, but because something inside him had already begun winning a battle he had no weapons for. Louis the XIV moved deeper into the winter of his suffering, with a growing awareness that his body was no longer obeying the principles that had once governed it. And although he continued to wrap himself in silk and ceremony, there were moments when the illusion of his strength slipped through his fingers like water he could no longer hold, leaving him shivering in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. His mornings began earlier than before, because the pain no longer let him drift into the deep, dreamless sleep he had once considered routine. And by the time the first candles were lit in his chambers, he had already been awake for hours, staring at the kneeling figures embroidered into the canopy, watching them blur as the throbbing in his lower body pulsed with a rhythm that seemed determined to break him piece by piece. He found himself adjusting his position so frequently that the servants assigned to help him dress started moving with exaggerated gentleness, terrified that one misplaced touch would provoke a reaction they weren't meant to see. And Louis, sensing their fear, forced himself to nod calmly, as if to remind them and himself that kings did not flinch. Yet the truth was that he flinched constantly now, though he hid it behind long breaths and measured gestures that gave the impression of patience rather than fragility. The infection had begun affecting more than his nerves and muscles. It had invaded the rhythm of his days, shaping the decisions he made and the rituals he abandoned and the moments of silence he now required between tasks. And while no one dared question him, they noticed changes that spread like cracks across the palace. Meetings were shortened, ceremonies were delayed, letters were dictated instead of delivered in person. The king's voice, once resonant and unwavering, now carried a faint rasp at certain hours, as if the pain beneath his robes had reached something inside his chest and tightened its grip around his breath. When ambassadors approached him, they bowed deeper than before, not out of reverence, but out of a subtle fear that they were witnessing the decline of a man whose presence had shaped the continent for more than 7 decades. The infection had begun eating into his sleep, into his appetite, into the very sense of control that had defined him since childhood. He found himself snapping awake at night, gripping the sheets with his nails, digging into the embroidery, unable to tell whether the throbbing had worsened or whether his mind had learned to fear the darkness itself. His physicians, now summoned more frequently, carried into his chambers a quiet dread they could no longer disguise because their treatments, once offered with confident assurance, had devolved into hesitant experiments, each one leaving the king more exhausted than before. Their hands trembled as they prepared poultices and tinctures, because the wound had grown beyond the shallow injury they had once believed it to be, and now it radiated heat even through layers of cloth, a reminder of the infection's relentless march deeper into his system. Louis tried to maintain the image of command, but he could not deny that his steps had slowed. Walking across a chamber now felt like traversing a long, uneven field. Each movement calculated, each shift of weight accompanied by a muted gasp he prayed no one heard. Sometimes he leaned on furniture when attendants turned their heads, pressing a hand against a gilded table or the carved frame of a doorway just long enough to steady himself. And although he resumed his regal posture before anyone looked back, those moments chipped away at the version of himself he had crafted so meticulously throughout his reign. He found himself thinking often of the earlier years when his stride had been decisive, when courtiers parted like the sea before him, when military victories and architectural triumphs had felt effortless, as if he had been carved from some material stronger than flesh. But now he understood the cruel truth that time had been waiting quietly to collect its debt. He still attended Mass, though each step toward the chapel cost him more effort than the last. And during the hours he spent standing for prayers or listening to chants echo through the vaulted ceilings, he sometimes felt the pain building into a pressure so intense he feared the wound would burst. The infection, once a quiet intruder, had grown bold, sending waves of heat through his abdomen and legs, leaving him dizzy and lightheaded. And after each service, he needed a moment alone in a side chamber. Gripping the stone wall while his vision steadied, he allowed no one to follow him inside, not even his most trusted attendants, because he could not bear the thought of anyone witnessing the weakness that had begun unraveling his composure. Kings were supposed to endure silently, and he tried to honor that expectation even as silence itself became another weight he struggled to carry. And yet, despite his suffering, the machinery of Versailles continued functioning around him, its wheels spinning because they had been built to revolve around the king whether he stood strong or faltered. The courtiers danced, drank, strategized, and flattered, refusing to acknowledge the anxiety growing beneath their powdered wigs. They had built their lives on proximity to his power, and the possibility that his body might be failing stirred a fear deeper than loyalty, a fear for their own futures, their own status, the fragile structure of a court that depended on a monarch who no longer moved like the center of gravity they had long assumed him to be. The palace was beginning to observe him differently now, not with awe but with careful evaluation, as if each gesture he made carried clues about how long he might remain standing. Louis sensed this change, and it stung more deeply than the infection itself, because he had spent his life cultivating the illusion of absolute stability. And now he felt the gaze of those around him shifting, like the softest echo of betrayal. There were days he dismissed everyone from his chambers for long stretches of time, just to breathe without feeling watched. And during those hours he would sit on the edge of his bed, palms pressed into the mattress, trying to position his body in a way that minimized the throbbing. Sometimes he sat motionless for so long that the candles burned halfway down before he realized time had passed. And in that stillness he felt himself slipping into memories of youth, of triumph, of moments when he believed himself untouchable. Those memories felt like warm rooms in a house he could no longer enter. And each time he returned to the present, he found himself grieving for the strength he had once taken for granted. The physicians monitored him carefully, measuring his pulse, studying his complexion, whispering in corners about the growth of the infection. But they never spoke plainly to him, because the truth was too dangerous for them to articulate. They could not admit they were losing control. They could not confess how limited their knowledge truly was. Instead, they offered reassurances that sounded hollow to his ears. And Louis, who had studied men all his life, recognized fear in their politeness. He began preparing himself mentally for something he could not yet name, a sense that the horizon was narrowing, that his life was inching toward a point of no return. He began writing more letters, signing more decrees, ensuring that affairs of state continued smoothly, even as his body undermined him with every heartbeat. There were moments when he stood by the window overlooking the gardens, unable to walk among them as he once had, and he watched the shifting clouds with a sense of detachment, as if the world outside his chambers had become a distant realm. He wondered whether the people of France sensed his decline, whether whispers had begun spreading beyond the palace walls, whether the image of the Sun King had begun to dim in the imagination of a population that had grown accustomed to his unshakable presence. These thoughts pressed on him with a heaviness that mingled with the physical pain, creating a burden that felt larger than his body could contain. He had always believed that legacy was something carved through grand acts, through wars won and monuments raised and policies reinforced with the weight of absolute authority. But now, in the quiet suffering of his illness, he discovered a different kind of legacy, one born out of fragility rather than might. He began recognizing that his life would not be remembered solely through his displays of power, but also through the way time unraveled him, through the human truth that even the greatest kings could not command the inner workings of their own flesh. And as he stood there, leaning slightly against the cold stone for balance, he understood that the infection had become more than an ailment. It had become a mirror reflecting everything he had ignored, everything he had denied, everything he had believed himself strong enough to escape. Louis the 14th entered a phase of his suffering in which every aspect of his daily existence began collapsing inward, not in sudden dramatic bursts, but in a slow, bruising rhythm that deepened with each passing week. And although the palace around him still shimmered with the pageantry he had spent a lifetime constructing, he could feel the foundation beneath it shifting like sand. His body, once disciplined and elegant in its movements, had begun betraying him in ways he could no longer conceal, and the infection had rooted itself so firmly inside him that even the slightest adjustment in posture felt like an invitation for fresh waves of pain to roll through his frame. He had learned by now that mornings were the harshest, not because the pain was greater, but because waking reminded him that he had to endure another entire day of performing strength, while his insides pulled at him with relentless cruelty. And he lay quietly each dawn, listening to the rustle of servants, preparing his garments while he gathered the courage to lift himself from the mattress. The court still expected him to maintain a certain rhythm, and although they tiptoed around him with rehearsed delicacy, the pressure of their presence pressed into his consciousness like a heavy thumb against a bruise. The rituals that had once energized him now felt like lead weights dragging behind every gesture. The act of dressing, once a theatre of dominance in which nobles competed for the privilege of fastening a buckle or handing him a sleeve, had transformed into a private battlefield, each layer of clothing adding strain to a body that no longer allowed him to forget its fragility. He leaned subtly against attendants as they laced his garments, relying on their support more than he let on. And even when they stepped back and bowed, he could still feel the ghost of their hands under his elbows, steadying him in ways they would never dare acknowledge aloud. Once he stepped into the public eye, the palace seemed to inhale, watching him with a quiet intensity that had not existed in earlier years. Every movement he made was analyzed, every flicker of discomfort noted, and the weight of being observed from all angles forced him to tighten his jaw and lift his chin with an authority that had become increasingly difficult to maintain. The infection pulsed beneath his clothes, a steady throbbing that spread warmth and pressure through his lower body. And there were moments in council meetings when his vision blurred at the edges and he had to blink slowly, controlling his breath so no one could detect the tremor building inside him. Even standing had become treacherous, because shifting his weight brought sharp stabs that radiated through his pelvis and abdomen. Yet he forced himself to remain upright, gripping the back of a chair or the carved edge of a table whenever he believed the room was distracted. Every hour now contained a negotiation between his authority and his agony. He could feel the infection tightening its hold, making it increasingly difficult to move without calculating pain beforehand. And he began to experience a strange sense of detachment, as though his body existed in a different dimension, one he had to inhabit carefully, like a fragile house that might collapse under pressure. At times he found himself speaking in shorter phrases because maintaining steady breath over long sentences exhausted him. And his ministers, who had studied his patterns for decades, sensed the shift with unease. They glanced at one another more often, their whispers sharp, their expressions drawn, because a weakening king meant a weakening monarchy, and the tension around the throne thickened like humidity before a storm. The infection also began affecting his digestion, his appetite shrinking until food felt more like an obligation than a comfort. Meals stretched into long, silent sessions in which he stared at plates he could not bring himself to finish, carving small, meaningless lines into the surface of his bread before pushing it aside. The rich dishes that had once been emblematic of Versailles became almost grotesque to him, their heavy scents turning his stomach, and although servants removed each plate discreetly, he saw the flicker of concern in their eyes. He drank more water now, not from thirst, but because swallowing anything else felt like adding weight to an already overburdened system. His attendants tried to encourage him, offering milder broths and softer fruits, but each attempt left him fatigued rather than nourished. And by the end of meals, he often needed several minutes to steady himself before standing. The nights were even worse, because the quiet gave the pain space to unfurl without distraction. When darkness settled across Versailles, the infection seemed to awaken, heating the skin around the wound until it felt feverish, making him shift endlessly as he tried to find a position that offered even a moment's relief. He often rose from bed, pacing carefully across the room, one hand pressed against the wall while he breathed through the spasms. The polished floor felt cold beneath his feet, and the air carried a faint echo of gardens beyond the windows. But none of it soothed him. He grew accustomed to the way the shadows lengthened across the chamber, the way candle flames wavered when he passed them, the way the night amplified every throb until it felt like the infection was whispering directly into his bones. Sometimes he would sit by the hearth and stare into the embers, letting the glow wash over him, while he thought of all the years he had outrun the vulnerabilities that came so naturally to other men. And in those moments, he felt both ancient and terrifyingly human. His physicians visited him more frequently now, moving through the corridors with a haste they tried to disguise as professionalism. They carried boxes of instruments, jars of tinctures, and bundles of herbs, but their treatments had begun to resemble desperate improvisations rather than confident remedies. The wound had deepened in ways that alarmed them, its edges inflamed and tender, emitting a heat that suggested the infection had burrowed farther into his tissue than they dared say aloud. Their faces betrayed a tension they attempted to hide under stiff bows and soft reassurances. But Louis, who had spent his life dissecting expressions for truth, recognized that fear had settled into their eyes. They examined him, cleaned the wound with gentle hands, applied poultices that stung his skin, and whispered instructions he could barely hear over the hum of discomfort. Each intervention left him exhausted, his body trembling slightly afterward, and he would dismiss them with a nod, retreating into silence until the chamber emptied, But even as his physical world shrank around him, the demands of a kingdom did not relent. Letters continued arriving from foreign courts. Reports accumulated on his desk, and petitions from the nobility required his judgment. He forced himself to read, to sign, to decide, even when the words blurred and the paper seemed heavier than gold leaf. His ministers tried to shield him from the more exhausting matters, but Louis insisted on maintaining control. It was not simply pride, it was survival. Losing authority felt more frightening than pain, because authority had been the armor he wore for his entire life. Yet each time he pushed himself too far, his body retaliated, sending a sharp reminder through his spine that his strength was dwindling. There were days when he walked to the balcony, overlooking the expansive gardens. Not because he intended to stay long, but because he needed to feel the world outside his chambers. From that height he watched the gardeners tending the hedges, the fountains rising into the warm air, the symmetry of nature shaped by human hands. And he felt a sorrow he could not name. The gardens were an extension of his will, a monument to control and order. But his body now disobeyed every law he had ever imposed on it. He rested his hands on the stone rail and closed his eyes, absorbing the cool breeze, imagining for just a moment that he could step down the stairs and walk freely among the manicured paths. But the truth pressed against him like gravity. Every movement required caution. Every breath required intention. Every day required more effort than the last. The infection began to carve a new loneliness into him, one different from the solitude he had always carried as a king. This loneliness was internal, rooted in the realization that no one could share his suffering. No one could truly understand the weight that pressed against him from within. He stopped talking about the pain because the words felt too vulnerable, too revealing, and so he held it inside, letting it accumulate like smoke trapped behind glass. It changed the way he looked at the world. He found himself studying people's faces more closely, noticing how expressions softened or tightened depending on how he moved, recognizing that the court was beginning to anticipate his decline like a tide they could neither reverse nor ignore. His illness had become the silent axis around which the palace spun. And yet, despite the growing shadows, Louis refused to relinquish the force of presence that had defined him. Each morning he still put on his jewels, still walked through the halls with his head high, still summoned the voice of a monarch who believed himself the center of a divine order. But beneath the velvet and gold, his body whispered truths he could not silence. The infection was tightening its grip. His strength was thinning. His reign was slowly bending under the weight of an enemy too small for the world to see and too powerful for any physician to stop. Louis the 14th entered a stage of his suffering where time itself began to warp around the rhythm of his pain, stretching in long, unbroken strands that made the days indistinguishable from one another. And although the palace continued its celebrations and intrigues with the same flamboyant devotion it had always shown, he felt increasingly separated from it all, as though the world beyond his chambers was sinking into a distant haze. The infection inside him, once a subtle discomfort he had forced himself to ignore, now commanded so much of his strength that even preparing for the morning rituals required a discipline bordering on punishment. And he found himself rising earlier and earlier, not because he wished to, but because sleep could no longer anchor him to the night. Every attempt to rest dissolved into restless tossing, as waves of throbbing heat rolled through the inflamed tissue beneath his garments. And by the time the first attendant whispered at his door, preparing to initiate the elaborate choreography of dressing, he had already spent hours negotiating with his own body. He no longer had the luxury of choosing how the day would unfold. His body chose for him, dictating the pace of his movements, the depth of his breath, the length of his endurance, and yet he persisted with a stubbornness that had shaped his entire identity. The ritual of dressing, which he had always used as a tool of intimidation and spectacle, had now transformed into something much more fragile, punctuated by careful pauses as attendants worked around the king's stiff posture. Their hands moved slowly, gently adjusting fabric so that seams and folds would not aggravate the wound. And Louis, determined not to reveal the magnitude of his suffering, forced himself to stand motionless, though the pressure building inside him sent small tremors along his spine. Each new garment added weight to his frame, each layer becoming another burden he had to carry through the day. But he allowed no complaint to escape him, clinging to the authority he had spent a lifetime cultivating. As he stepped into public view, the polished floors reflected his image back to him, and for the first time in his life he felt a strange disconnect between the man he saw and the man he remembered being. The court regarded him with a reverence mixed with something else, something quieter, sharper, a watchfulness that had not existed before. They bowed, they smiled, they murmured pleasantries. But beneath the choreography of etiquette lay an undercurrent of unease, because everyone could sense that the king's movements had grown slower, his posture slightly more guarded, his gestures more deliberate than they had ever been. The infection had begun dictating the rhythm of his presence. And even though he maintained the facade of control, those around him noticed the small hesitations, the fleeting grimaces that flickered across his face when he thought no one was looking. Meetings in the council chamber had become grueling, not because of the matters discussed, but because the simple act of standing required a constant calculation. The wound deepened with each passing week, radiating pain that made it difficult for him to shift his weight without revealing strain. And although he forced himself to remain upright through most deliberations, he sometimes gripped the carved wooden edge of the table to anchor himself when a particularly sharp pulse surged through him. The councillors, who had once relied on his confident leadership, now watched him with a blend of concern and dread, careful not to let their expressions betray how deeply the king's suffering unsettled them. Louis noticed this shift, and it stung him more than he allowed himself to acknowledge, because he understood that power did not merely come from decree, but from perception. And for the first time in his reign, he felt that perception slipping beyond his control. The nights offered no refuge. When the candles were extinguished and the corridors grew silent, the infection seemed to expand within him, as though darkness gave it permission to spread more boldly. Louis often rose from bed, pacing with slow, measured steps across the cold floor, the echo of his footfalls sounding like a hollow rhythm, marking the decline of his once unshakable presence. He found himself pausing frequently, clutching the back of a chair or resting a hand on the window frame to steady himself as the pain tightened across his abdomen. The moonlight spilling through the glass illuminated the deep lines that had formed around his eyes, lines carved by exhaustion, denial, and fear. In the privacy of these hours, he could no longer hide from the truth that he was fighting a battle he could not win. And yet, he kept moving, driven by the same force that had carried him through wars, betrayals, and decades of rule, the belief that a king must never surrender. The physicians continued their attempts to treat him, but their visits grew increasingly somber as it became clear that their methods were not stopping the infection's advance. They brought new poultices, new herbs, new tools, each one promising temporary relief at best. And Louis endured their ministrations with stoic determination, even when the procedures sent sharp flares of pain through his lower body. The wound had grown uglier, a swollen, inflamed passage that seeped heat and pressure and threatened to spread deeper with every movement he made. Even the physicians, who prided themselves on maintaining composure, struggled to mask their alarm, and Louis read the truth in the way their hands hesitated before touching him, in the way their eyes darted away before returning with forced calm. They whispered among themselves in corridors, their voices low and urgent, and although they tried to protect him from despair, Louis had lived too long and seen too much to be protected from anything now. The infection began affecting his internal balance, leaving him lightheaded during long ceremonies and unsteady when rising too quickly. There were moments when the edges of his vision darkened, forcing him to pause in doorways or lean discreetly against walls to prevent himself from collapsing. Servants noticed this before courtiers did, because they bore witness to the backstage version of the king's life, the version stripped of the grandeur that public rituals demanded. They saw him gripping his bedpost when he rose, saw the stiffness in his movements when he tried to walk without assistance, saw the haunted look in his eyes when the pain became too sharp to conceal. Yet they said nothing, because their duty was silence, and they honored it with a loyalty that bordered on fear. Louis found unexpected clarity in these moments of vulnerability. While pacing his chambers late at night, he reflected on the architecture of his power, the intricately constructed world that had relied on his image as much as his decisions. He considered the wars he had waged, the policies he had enforced, the lavish spectacles he had orchestrated to keep the court under his control. He thought of the gardens of Versailles, shaped into perfection under his direction, every hedge and fountain designed to reflect a universe centered around him. But now his body felt like a garden left untended, overrun by something wild and relentless, and the realization unsettled him in ways he had never experienced. His life, once defined by precision and calculated dominance, had become a series of unpredictable impulses, governed by a wound too small for the world to see and too powerful for him to overcome. His appetite diminished further, leaving him weak and hollow, and the meals that once represented abundance now symbolized an obligation he struggled to fulfill. He avoided rich dishes entirely, choosing instead broths and watered wine, though even swallowing these left him fatigued. His weight began to drop, subtly at first, then more noticeably, his robes hanging slightly looser, the bones of his face sharpening into angles that betrayed how much the infection was draining him. Courtiers murmured quietly in the shadows about his changing appearance, their whispers drifting through the palace like fragile threads, weaving new narratives of uncertainty. Despite the physical decline, Louis clung to routine with a ferocity that surprised even himself. He insisted on attending council sessions, insisted on receiving ambassadors, insisted on walking through the Hall of Mirrors when he felt steady enough. These actions were not mere stubbornness, they were his last defense against the erosion of power. But each time he forced himself to move with royal composure, he felt the wound strike back with renewed intensity, sending waves of fire through his core. He learned to conceal his grimaces by lowering his head as if contemplating a matter of state, masking weakness with the illusion of thought. One evening, while seated near the window as the sky bled into shades of violet and gold, Louis experienced a moment that marked a shift in his understanding of the path ahead. The infection sent a surge of pain so intense that he gripped the armrest with enough force to whiten his knuckles. His breath caught in his throat as the world tilted. When the surge finally retreated, he remained motionless, staring at the gardens while the twilight deepened. He realized then that the battle he faced was no longer simply about endurance. It was about the preservation of what little strength remained. It was about accepting that the infection was no longer an inconvenience, but an adversary capable of toppling the king who had once ruled Europe like a colossus. And as night settled once more over Versailles, Louis understood with chilling clarity that the infection was not merely wounding him. It was dismantling him from within, piece by piece. And every day ahead would demand a greater price than the day before. Louis the 14th pressed onward through his deterioration, with a determination so fierce it bordered on delusion. Not because he believed he would recover, but because accepting the truth felt like giving the infection permission to win. And the man who had spent a lifetime bending Europe to his will refused to surrender to something he could not see. Yet the infection, had begun asserting its presence with a brutality he could no longer mask. His body felt heavier than ever before, as though each limb had been filled with molten metal. And waking each morning required a deliberate negotiation between what his mind demanded of him and what his flesh could endure. He lay still for long stretches before calling his attendants. Because the first movement of the day, the simple act of shifting his weight, sent a sharp tearing sensation through his lower body that made him grit his teeth against the groan rising in his throat. When the attendants finally entered, they approached him with the cautious reverence usually reserved for sacred relics rather than living monarchs. Their steps soft, their voices hushed, their gestures spare and precise. They had learned by now to leave more space between each part of the dressing ritual, allowing the king small breaths of stillness to manage the pain. And Louis, who once revelled in the elaborate choreography of his morning routine, now viewed it as a gauntlet he had to survive before facing the day. The layers of silk and brocade felt suffocating as they settled onto his body, trapping warmth against the inflamed skin beneath. And even the weight of the crown, which in earlier years felt like a symbol of purpose, now pressed uncomfortably against his temples. Yet he allowed none of this to show, lifting his chin as the final touches were made, forcing himself into the silhouette of power even as his body begged for relief. The court greeted him with its usual polished grandeur, but the atmosphere had shifted in ways even the most oblivious courtier could no longer ignore. Conversations quieted when he entered the room. Eyes flicked toward him with an anxious precision, studying his walk, his posture, his breathing. These people who had spent decades performing loyalty now performed something more fragile: concern disguised as admiration. The infection, though hidden beneath his garments, had become a silent participant in every interaction, an unspoken truth that shaped the air between him and the nobles who depended on his stability. Louis noticed every flicker of suspicion in their expressions, every pointed glance exchanged behind fans and cuffs, and although he did not acknowledge it outwardly, the recognition pierced him deeper than any physical pain. The council meetings, once the arena where his authority manifested with unstoppable force, had become increasingly draining. The infection sent relentless pressure through his abdomen, making it nearly impossible for him to stand without leaning discreetly on nearby furniture. He timed his movements carefully, shifting when the room's attention drifted away, masking the tremors that rattled his legs with the illusion of contemplation. His voice, though still authoritative, carried a subtle tremble at certain moments, as if each command required immense effort to push past the wall of discomfort tightening around his chest. The councillors tried their best to maintain composure, but the tension in the room thickened each day as they exchanged glances loaded with meaning. The king was weakening, the monarchy trembling with him. The infection had begun altering not just his movements, but the way he experienced the world. Sounds seemed sharper, echoing painfully in his skull when he was exhausted. Light felt harsher, burning at his eyes during ceremonies in the Hall of Mirrors. Even scents became overwhelming: perfumes too heavy, food too rich, candles too smoky. Everything that had once delighted him as a king now agitated him as a man fighting a battle deep within his own body. He excused himself from gatherings earlier than before, retreating to the privacy of his chamber under the pretense of important state matters, though the truth was that his strength crumbled more quickly now, leaving him unable to endure the long hours of performance the court demanded. In the quiet of his private rooms, Louis felt the full extent of the infection's advance. Sitting had become nearly impossible, the pressure unbearable, sending stabbing jolts through his lower back and pelvis. Standing too long made his legs tremble. Bending even slightly ignited a firestorm of sensation that forced him to freeze in place until the flare subsided. He paced in slow, shuffling steps, his hand, always seeking the nearest source of stability, the bedpost, a chair, the carved moulding of the wall. His breathing grew shallow, not from age, but from the intensity of pressure radiating from the inflamed tissue inside him. Even lying down required a careful choreography of angles and motions, because one wrong shift could send him spiraling into a spasm he could not suppress. The physicians, increasingly desperate, began proposing more invasive treatments. They suggested deeper incisions, harsher cleansings, riskier interventions. Louis listened with the stoic patience of a man who understood that none of these would bring true relief. The physicians' voices quivered as they described the procedures, their eyes betraying how uncertain they felt beneath their professional facades. Once they left his chamber, he often heard them whispering anxiously in the hallway, debating options that none of them believed would save him. Their fear confirmed what Louis had begun to accept: he was no longer fighting the infection to live. He was fighting it to remain king for as long as possible. Food lost its appeal entirely. The sight of heavy sauces and roasted meats that once symbolized the decadence of Versailles now filled him with nausea. He forced himself to sip broth or take small bites of soft bread, but each swallow reminded him of how hollow he had become, how much weight he had lost beneath the folds of his royal attire. His cheeks had grown sharper, his eyes slightly sunken, and even though he maintained composure in public, he could see the truth reflected in the polished surfaces of the palace. The Sun King, once radiant with vitality, now bore the unmistakable signs of decline. And this realization struck him in the deepest part of his pride. Nights had become the hardest stretch of each 24-hour cycle. The infection pulsed more violently in the dark, as though emboldened by the absence of distraction. And he spent hours awake, pacing from one end of his chamber to the other. He stopped frequently to steady himself against a wall or the ornate edge of a fireplace, breathing slowly, attempting to quiet the erratic contractions of pain. The moonlight spilled across the floor in pale stripes, catching the sweat on his brow, highlighting the tremors in his hands. Every night, he silently questioned how much longer he could maintain the charade of control. And every morning, he answered himself by rising and preparing for another day of pretending strength. He had begun avoiding mirrors whenever possible. They reflected a version of himself he did not recognize, a man whose regal posture had been replaced by subtle stiffness, whose eyes carried shadows no crown could hide. Yet he could not fully escape the truth. Even courtiers who attempted to speak to him with warmth could not disguise the faint worry in their expressions. His presence had become a reminder that time was no respecter of crowns, and the infection served as an invisible force, eroding the foundation of a monarchy that had seemed indestructible for more than 70 years. Still, Louis forced himself to appear each day before the court, partly out of duty, and partly out of a desire to maintain the illusion of stability for as long as he could. He understood the political consequences of his suffering better than anyone. A weakening king meant a weakening state. A weakening state meant opportunists waiting in the shadows. That knowledge alone kept him from collapsing into the vulnerability that gnawed at him with every breath. He clung to his authority not because he believed he could outlive the infection, but because he feared what would happen to France if he relinquished it too soon. During rare moments of solitude, he found himself contemplating mortality in ways he had never allowed before. He thought of the vast structure of Versailles, the thousands of people who depended on him, the wars he had waged, the art he had nurtured, the nation he had reshaped. He wondered what would remain of his legacy once he could no longer uphold it, and whether the infection that consumed him might eventually consume the monarchy itself. There was a strange comfort in these thoughts, a grounding honesty he had never permitted himself to explore. And though the pain was constant, a quiet clarity began forming in the spaces between each wave of agony. He understood now that power had never truly belonged to him. It had always been borrowed, sustained by the illusion that he was invincible. Louis the Fourteenth drifted into a period where the very rhythm of his existence seemed to fracture under the strain of the infection eating its way through him. And although he fought with the same stubborn pride that had carried him through wars and rebellions, there was no longer any denying that something inside him was shifting irrevocably. The days had begun to arrive with a heaviness that pressed against his chest before he even opened his eyes. And the mornings that once unfolded with choreographed elegance now felt like a sequence of obstacles he had to conquer before the palace awoke to its duties. He remained motionless for long intervals, lying on his side with the blankets twisted around his legs, bracing himself for that first movement of the day, because the moment he tried to shift the infection seized him with such intensity that it felt like a hot blade dragging across the tissues buried deep within him. It left him breathless every time, gripping the edge of the mattress as though anchoring himself to the world he had ruled for so many decades. When the attendants entered, their faces bore the quiet dread of men who understood that their king was fighting battles none of them could see, and the way they moved cautiously, reverently, almost fearfully made Louis feel as though he had already crossed into a state of fragility he could not fully accept. They lifted the layers of fabric with trembling care, their hands guiding the sleeves and sashes as though handling a body that might break beneath their touch. And Louis, feeling the infection throbbing beneath his garments, forced himself to remain upright. Every motion felt deliberate, slow, and painfully finite. He could sense how much weight he had lost by the way his garments hung looser across his shoulders, and even the softest fabrics irritated the inflamed skin beneath. But he endured the ritual in silence, tightening his jaw as he prepared for another day of performing a version of himself that no longer existed. When he stepped into the public halls, the palace greeted him with an attentiveness that made his skin prickle, because there was no longer any pretense among the courtiers. They watched him with a vigilance that bordered on desperation, their eyes tracing every movement, every hesitation, every shift in his breath. These people, who had once bowed before him with the blind confidence of devotees, now lowered their heads with an uneasy reverence, aware that the sun around which they revolved was dimming. Their whispers had changed too, soft conversations rippling through the corridors, not about politics or gossip, but about the king's appearance. His posture, the color of his skin, the tremor in his hands. Louis sensed that the infection was no longer simply harming him. It was unsettling the very structure of the monarchy, sending ripples of fear through the court like cracks spreading across marble. The council meetings grew harder to endure. The infection had deepened to such an extent that standing felt like balancing on a fault line. Every shift of weight sending a surge of heat through his pelvis that made him want to collapse into the nearest chair, though he refused to do so. He remained upright, gripping the table with an authority that masked his desperation, forcing himself to speak in steady tones, even as sweat dampened the fabric beneath his sleeves. The councillors avoided looking at the places where his fingers tightened too hard against the polished wood, but they heard the subtle strain in his voice, and they knew. They could not disguise their fear any longer. Louis felt it radiating from them like a cold draft through an open window. They were terrified not only of losing their king, but of what might follow his fall. Outside the council chamber, the infection continued to shape every aspect of his life. Walking through the gardens became impossible, and even brief strolls through the Hall of Mirrors left him breathless. The reflections that once flattered him now betrayed him, revealing a figure whose posture had grown tighter and more rigid, a man leaning slightly forward to ease the pressure inside him. A monarch whose once proud stride had shortened into careful, measured steps. He avoided the mirrors whenever possible, turning his gaze away from the polished surfaces because the truth they offered felt too cruel. The vision of himself shrinking beneath the crown haunted him, undermining the certainty that had defined his reign. Meals became an exercise in endurance rather than nourishment. Louis could no longer tolerate more than a few spoonfuls of broth or a thin slice of softened fruit, and every swallow left a faint ache in his chest from the effort of forcing food into a body that no longer welcomed it. The royal chefs tried adjusting dishes, creating smaller portions, lighter flavors, gentler textures, but nothing restored his appetite. He could feel his strength leaking from him slowly, draining away in ways no medicine could reverse. And although he tried to maintain his composure at the table, he knew his attendants noticed the shaking of his hands and the way he pressed his lips tightly between bites. The physicians were now constant presences in his chambers. They arrived with carts of instruments that clinked under the weight of their worry, their expressions grim as they inspected the wound each day. It had swollen further, the surrounding tissue inflamed to a deep, angry hue, the infection spreading inwards with a stubborn momentum they could not halt. They attempted deeper cleanings, harsher applications of poultices, agonizing treatments that made Louis clench the bed frame until his knuckles blanched. Their whispers grew more panicked with each worsening sign, and although they attempted to reassure him with carefully chosen words, their eyes told the truth. They had reached the limit of what 17th century medicine could offer. The nights were the most merciless. The infection pulsed with a rhythm that felt almost alive, tightening around his lower body with a pressure that made sleep impossible. Louis paced for hours, shuffling in slow arcs across the chamber, one hand pressed to the small of his back as though trying to brace himself against an internal collapse. He often paused at the window, staring at the moonlit gardens with a quiet gravity that bordered on grief, because he knew he would never walk among them again. The idea settled deep within him, like a stone sinking through water. He rested his forehead briefly against the cold glass, letting the cool surface soothe the heat radiating from his core. In these moments, he allowed himself the vulnerability he denied in daylight. He acknowledged the truth that he was dying. This realization did not come in a dramatic wave, but in a slow, sorrowful acceptance that seeped into him like ink through cloth. He had lived through everything a king could face: wars, rebellions, shifting alliances, the deaths of loved ones, and yet he had always imagined he would meet his end with dignity, with grandeur, perhaps in the presence of his court or his family. But the infection had stolen that narrative from him. It was stripping him layer by layer, not only of strength, but of the illusion that kings were separate from the fragile realities of the body. He began to understand that his legacy would be shaped not only by the vastness of his accomplishments, but by the humility forced upon him in these final months. His relationships shifted subtly during this time as well. Those closest to him, the ones who had served him for decades, looked at him now with a tenderness that had never been permitted in the palace. Their hands lingered a moment longer when they helped him rise. Their voices softened when they addressed him. They paused more frequently to ensure he was steady. Louis, who had once demanded perfection in every gesture around him, found these small mercies strangely comforting. They reminded him that even in a palace built to glorify power, there could still be kindness in the quiet corners of servitude. But the infection continued to advance. Every day it claimed a little more of him. He began missing certain ceremonies altogether, his body no longer capable of maintaining the grueling schedule of royal life. The absence of the king from events he once dominated sent ripples through the palace and the country beyond. Diplomats requested audiences only to be told he was indisposed. Nobles gathered in private salons to discuss the rumors of his health. The monarchy, dependent on the presence of its living symbol, trembled in the shadow of his decline. Louis felt that tremor too. It seeped into his thoughts as he lay awake at night, listening to the muffled sounds of Versailles settling into darkness. He wondered whether the kingdom he had built was strong enough to survive without him, whether the scaffolding of his policies, his wars, his ambitions would hold once the central pillar fell. He thought of his successors, of the child who would one day inherit the crown, of the world that would continue turning long after he closed his eyes for the final time. And in these quiet reflections, he found a bittersweet clarity. He had spent a lifetime believing himself indispensable, and now he realized with a kind of sorrowful peace that even a king as mighty as the sun could fade. Louis the 14th entered a phase of decline in which every detail of his existence seemed suspended between the remnants of his authority and the silent erosion of his strength. And although he continued clinging to the rituals of sovereignty with the stubborn precision of a man who believed order could hold back fate, there was no longer any disguising the way his body resisted him. Each day began with a heaviness that settled first into his bones and then spread outward like a slow, suffocating tide. And when he opened his eyes, the ceiling above him seemed farther away than before, as if the room itself had widened in anticipation of his eventual fall. The infection had burrowed so deeply into him that the simple act of turning on his side required a careful sequence of breaths and pauses. And he often remained in one position until his limbs ached from stiffness, simply because shifting even a fraction of his weight invited a sharp, consuming burst of pain that stole his breath. When the attendants entered at dawn, they did so with an awareness that hung palpably in the air, a sense that their king had crossed into fragile territory where every motion demanded reverence. They approached him with hands folded and steps softened, their voices hushed, not from etiquette, but from worry, and Louis could feel their fear in the way they touched him, guiding him upright as though his body might splinter from the effort. Dressing him had become an ordeal, stretched across long intervals of silence, punctuated only by the rustle of fabric and the occasional involuntary sound he tried and failed to suppress when the infection ignited beneath the surface of his skin. The layers of brocade, the jewelry, the insignias of power that had once been symbols of his dominance now felt heavy, stifling, almost mocking. Yet he endured them because the alternative, the admission that he could not bear the weight, felt worse than the pain. As he stepped into the public corridors, the palace reacted to him, not with the awe it had displayed for decades, but with a charged stillness, a quiet that seemed reflexive, like the instinctive hush that falls over a crowd witnessing the faltering of a monument. Every gaze fixed upon him carried a sharpness that made his skin tighten, and although the courtiers bowed as they always had, their movements lacked the confident fluidity of earlier years. They watched with widened eyes as he walked, noting the subtle stiffness in his posture, the way he gripped the edge of his cloak when a wave of pain passed through him, the way his breath paused mid-sentence before continuing. Louis felt exposed in a way he had never been, as though the infection had illuminated the one truth he had spent a lifetime burying beneath the magnificence of his reign. Even kings were mortal. The council chamber, which had once vibrated with the certainty of his commands, now felt dense with unspoken fears. Ministers exchanged glances as he entered, their expressions stiff with concern, their voices lowered out of instinctive caution. Louis could sense the tension before a word was spoken. His presence no longer anchored the room, it unsettled it. He stood through most meetings, but standing demanded such effort that his hands frequently tightened around the carved back of a chair, as if it were the only thing tethering him to balance. He spoke with deliberation, his voice steady but softer than before, and although he delivered each decree with the same precision he had always commanded, he could feel the infection pulsing beneath the surface, sending a pressure upward into his abdomen, constricting his breath until each sentence felt like an expenditure of strength he could not spare. The physical toll deepened from day to day. The wound had grown more aggressive, seeping inflammation through the surrounding tissue and radiating heat that spread along his lower spine and into his legs. Walking became a negotiation between endurance and inevitability, his steps measured, his weight shifting cautiously, his muscles tightening with the effort of preserving dignity. Sitting was nearly impossible. Lying down offered only brief reprieve, and even standing upright demanded a fierce internal battle. He often paused in doorways, pretending to admire a tapestry while secretly waiting for the pain to ebb enough to continue. His skin, once vibrant with the vitality of a ruler who believed himself untouchable, had lost its color, turning paler with each passing day, and the hollowness beneath his eyes had deepened into a shadow that no amount of powdered cosmetics could hide. Meals had become a formality he no longer had the strength to pretend to enjoy. He pushed food across his plate without tasting it, swallowing only enough to keep up the appearance of participation. The flavors that once delighted him now seemed foreign, bland, or overwhelming, and even the lightest dishes felt heavy. His appetite had withered under the infection's constant assault, and although the chefs adapted their creations in an attempt to tempt him, he could barely stomach more than a few bites. His attendants stood behind him in stiff silence, witnessing every small decline, and although they never spoke of it, Louis could feel their concern like a weight pressing against the back of his chair. As the weeks unfolded, nights became increasingly merciless. The darkness amplified every throbbing pulse of the infection, making the hours stretch endlessly. Louis often rose before midnight, pacing slowly across the room with one hand trailing along the wall for support. He walked in loops, pausing only when the pain forced him to brace himself against furniture, his breath catching in his throat as he waited for the wave to pass. Candlelight flickered across the polished floor, casting warped reflections that made the chamber feel simultaneously larger and more confining. And Louis found himself staring into those shifting shapes, feeling an ache in his heart that had nothing to do with illness. He was starting to understand that he had reached a point beyond the reach of willpower. The infection no longer merely accompanied him, it consumed him. The physicians visited him multiple times a day now, bringing instruments and remedies with increasing desperation. They proposed new treatments, each more invasive than the last, and Louis submitted to their attempts with weary resignation. Their hands trembled as they worked, their voices strained with panic, and although they tried to reassure him, he could hear the truth in the way they spoke, hesitant, hopeful, uncertain. The wound was worsening beyond anything they had seen before, spreading deeper inside him, threatening the integrity of the tissues surrounding it. They applied balms that burned like fire, performed incisions that left him gasping, attempted procedures meant to drain and cleanse, but the infection continued its relentless advance, indifferent to their efforts. There were moments during these treatments when Louis felt his consciousness flicker, like a candle guttering in the wind. He held onto the bed frame with white-knuckled intensity, his breath caught between agony and sheer determination. And even when tears pricked the corners of his eyes, he refused to let them fall. The attendants who witnessed these moments looked as though they were watching not just a king, but a man being stripped of the last defenses he had left. Louis sensed their grief, their helplessness, and although a part of him longed to collapse into vulnerability, he forced himself to remain upright once the procedures ended, whispering that he was fine even though the words tasted like lies. The mornings after such treatments left him weaker. Rising from bed felt like lifting a mountain from his chest. The infection had begun affecting his heart rate, making it flutter at unpredictable intervals, each irregular beat sending a ripple of unease through his body. His movements slowed even further, and he found that he could no longer hide the tremor in his hands or the slight limp in his gait. When he walked through the halls, servants pretended not to notice, but courtiers whose lives revolved around interpreting the slightest shift in royal behavior saw everything. They watched with growing alarm, sensing how close the monarchy was to losing its axis. Louis felt that impending loss as well. In rare, quiet moments, he sat by the window, staring out across the sprawling gardens, remembering the years when he walked confidently among the hedges and fountains, surrounded by the splendor he had commanded into existence. Now the gardens felt distant, unreachable, a world belonging to someone he no longer was. He rested his hand against the cold stone edge, closing his eyes as the breeze pressed through the window, brushing his face with a gentleness that made him ache. The sensation reminded him of youth, of vitality, of a life that had once seemed limitless. But the present, with its relentless discomfort, its diminishing mobility, its unspoken dread, left little room for nostalgia. His world had shrunk to the confines of his chamber, his council, and the narrow space between two breaths when the pain briefly loosened. Each day marked a further withdrawal from the life he had built. Each night, a deeper descent into whispers of mortality. And although he still stood before the court with a fraction of his former stature, Louis understood now, more clearly than ever, that the infection was leading him toward an end he could neither delay nor disguise. Louis the 14th moved into the final stretch of his suffering with a mixture of resignation and defiance that twisted inside him like two opposing tides. And although he still clung to the habits that had defined him for more than 7 decades, his body had reached a point where even the smallest movement felt like crossing a threshold he was no longer meant to step over. The mornings no longer marked the beginning of a day so much as the continuation of a single, unbroken battle with the infection that had become his constant companion. When he opened his eyes, he felt the weight of the night still pressing into his bones, a heaviness that made it difficult to even breathe. And before he called for his attendants, he spent several long moments lying still, letting the pain settle into its familiar rhythm before daring to shift. Each adjustment of his body ignited a sharp, tearing sensation inside him, as though the wound grew teeth in the dark and sank deeper into the vulnerable tissues it had already claimed. The attendants now entered with an openness of grief they struggled to hide. Their faces, pale with sleeplessness, reflected the dread of men who had spent too many hours watching their sovereign gasp through waves of agony, and the room filled with a silence far heavier than etiquette demanded. They moved around him like mourners, preparing a body for its final rites, adjusting the linens, steadying him with hands that trembled, trying to mask how alarmed they were by the sight of the king's sunken cheeks and the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. Louis felt their worry, even when they did not speak. And although a part of him longed to ease their burden with reassurances, speech itself had become an effort that drained him. He endured their ministrations with clenched teeth and shallow breaths, each layer of clothing added with painful slowness as the infection pulsed beneath his garments like a living flame. When he finally stood, the world tilted slightly, the edges of his vision flickering with shadows that threatened to swallow the light, and he had to grip the bedpost until the dizziness receded. His legs no longer felt steady beneath him. The muscles had weakened, trembling under the strain of supporting his weight. Walking had become a fragile negotiation between balance and collapse. Every step required careful planning, each foot placed deliberately, the infection radiating a deep internal heat that spread up his spine and into his abdomen. By the time he approached the doors of his chamber, his breath had already shortened, and the attendants hovered behind him like guardians terrified he might fall. The palace reacted to him now with a profound sadness, disguised behind the formalities of court life. Courtiers bowed lower than before, not in ceremony, but in sympathy, and they stepped aside with unusual haste, their faces tight with grief. Conversation ceased when he passed, replaced by a silence that stretched through the hallways like a shadow. Even the rustle of silk seemed muted, as though Versailles itself had begun holding its breath. Louis felt the weight of their eyes on him, saw the anxiety flickering at the edges of their expressions. I heard the tremor in their voices when they greeted him. He recognized the fear behind their courtesy. They were not merely worried for their king, they were afraid that the sun around which their entire world revolved was flickering. Council meetings had grown so difficult that he now attended them less frequently. And when he did, he needed to brace himself against the table within minutes. The infection no longer offered him small reprieves. It surged continuously, its inflammation spreading deeper into the tissues surrounding the wound, sending bursts of pressure upward into his chest that made breathing feel like inhaling through a tightening noose. Speaking required effort that left him trembling. He often paused mid-sentence, pretending to deliberate when in truth he was fighting to steady his breath. Ministers exchanged glances filled with dread, understanding that the monarchy they depended on was unraveling before their eyes. Louis sensed their fear, and though it angered him, it also broke something inside him, because he knew they saw the truth he had tried so hard to hide. His world narrowed further each day. The walks he once forced himself to take became impossible. The Hall of Mirrors, once a stage for his unshakable power, now felt like a corridor of accusations, every reflection showing a thinner, paler version of the man he used to be. He avoided mirrors entirely, turning his face away from polished surfaces, unwilling to confront the hollowed eyes staring back. Even the gardens he adored became nothing more than distant scenery seen through the windows of his chambers. The scent of flowers, the murmur of fountains, the rustle of leaves in the wind, these had once been extensions of his identity, but now they belonged to a world he could no longer touch. The physicians had reached the limits of their knowledge long before this stage, yet they continued visiting him multiple times each day, driven by desperation rather than hope. They experimented with harsher treatments, opening new incisions that made Louis cry out despite himself. Applying burning tinctures meant to draw the infection outward, probing the wound with trembling fingers as though trying to find some hidden edge where the disease might surrender. The air in his chamber often smelled of antiseptic herbs and blood, a heavy, metallic scent that clung to the walls. The infection had begun producing deeper swelling, the tissue around it darkening, weakening, threatening to collapse inward. Each treatment left him weak, trembling, drenched in sweat. The physicians whispered among themselves, fearful that the infection might soon enter his bloodstream fully, a development they would be powerless to combat. Meals became an ordeal he could no longer face. He refused plates, waved away food, drank only when his attendants begged him. His lips had grown cracked, his skin dry, his voice faint. His weight continued dropping, leaving him with sharp cheekbones and hollowed temples. The infection had not only robbed him of strength, but of hunger, of desire, of everything that had once tied him to life. The crown that once rested on his head with proud certainty now felt like a burden too heavy to bear. He wore it only when absolutely necessary, and even then it pressed into him, with a cruel reminder of the expectations he could no longer fulfill. The nights had grown unbearable. Sleep no longer visited him. The infection produced a deep throbbing heat that intensified after sunset, spreading outward in waves that made his skin feel too tight for his bones. He paced the chamber without respite, moving in uneven circles, pausing whenever the pain struck too hard, forcing himself to breathe through the intensity. His attendants sometimes found him gripping the windowsill, face pale, body trembling, staring at the moonlit gardens as though searching for the life he had lost. He spoke little now, and when he did, his voice carried the quiet resignation of a man who understood the limits of his endurance. Yet even in these darkest hours, he clung to the remnants of dignity. He continued signing decrees when he could, continued receiving certain ambassadors, continued insisting on aspects of ritual that gave him structure. These acts were not symbolic, they were lifelines. They tethered him to the identity he refused to surrender, even as his body betrayed him. The infection had become a shadow inside him, stretching across every moment of his consciousness. Yet he fought to remain the king he had always been. But the truth pressed closer each day. The infection had infiltrated deeper into his tissues, spreading along pathways no physician could reach. He began experiencing chills so severe his teeth chattered, followed by fevers that left him delusional. There were moments when he did not recognize the people around him, moments when he could not remember what day it was, moments when he reached for objects that were not there. His heart fluttered unpredictably, skipping beats, racing without warning, slowing suddenly, as if reconsidering its duty. His breath turned shallow, uneven, as though he were inhaling through a narrowing tunnel. As the palace watched these changes with growing dread, Louis felt something inside him shift, an acceptance that he could no longer outrun his fate. He began taking longer pauses at the window, his gaze drifting across the gardens he would never walk again. He lingered over documents, not because he needed more time to read them, but because holding the quill made him feel alive. He touched the carved edges of furniture with a tenderness he had never shown before, as though grounding himself in the world he had shaped. And in these quiet moments, he confronted the truth he had resisted for so long. The infection was no longer simply killing him. It was preparing him. It was ushering him toward the final chapter of his reign, toward the end of a life that had redefined an era. And although he had always imagined he would meet his death as an emperor, strong and dignified, he now understood with a clarity sharper than pain that mortality had its own plans. Louis the Fourteenth drifted into his final days with a consciousness that flickered between clarity and haze, as though his mind were a lantern guttering in a relentless wind. And although he tried to hold on to the rituals of his rule, the infection inside him had grown into a force that shaped every breath, every thought, every tremor of his weakening body. The hours no longer measured themselves in the rhythms of royal duties, but in the pulse of pain radiating through his lower body, a constant burning pressure that made the boundaries of time dissolve into an indistinct blur. His bed had become both a refuge and a cage, a place where he rested because he had no choice, yet also a place that magnified the agony each time he shifted. And he found himself sinking deeper into the mattress, as though the weight of the palace, the crown, and the expectations of an entire empire were pressing him downward. When attendants entered his chamber at dawn, their faces carried the unmistakable grief of men who had spent too many nights watching their sovereign fade. And the once precise rituals of morning preparation had softened into gestures shaped more by sorrow than ceremony. They moved in slow, careful arcs, their hands trembling as they adjusted his pillows, smoothed his sheets, or offered him sips of water. Louis, who had once commanded armies with unwavering confidence, he now felt his strength measured in the inches. He could lift his head, or the seconds he could hold himself upright. Even the smallest effort sent ripples of pain through his abdomen, forcing him to close his eyes and breathe through the waves of heat that followed. He could no longer stand without assistance. The infection had spread so deeply that his legs trembled violently when he attempted to rise, and the simple act of sitting upright required the support of 2 attendants who had learned to read his breath, adjusting their grip whenever they sensed the pain tightening through him. His robes, once symbols of grandeur, now hung loosely from a frame that had grown startlingly thin, and although he still wore them when absolutely necessary, the weight of the fabric felt heavy and foreign against his fragile skin. He spoke less now, saving what little breath he had for moments that mattered, and his voice, once strong enough to command silence in a hall of hundreds, had softened to a frail whisper that struggled to escape his lips. Versailles moved around him like a great machine, losing momentum, its rituals slowing, its corridors filled with uneasy quiet. Courtiers walked softly, speaking in tones that barely rose above a murmur, as though afraid that loud voices might shatter what remained of the king's strength. Rumours drifted through the palace like smoke rumours of his worsening fever, his weakened heart, his fading lucidity, and each whisper carried the same heavy truth. The sun that had illuminated France for more than 70 years was sinking. Louis could feel this shift even from his bed. He sensed the weight of the silence, the hesitancy in the footsteps outside his chamber, the unspoken fear that rippled through the palace he had built to reflect his invincibility. The physicians visited him with increasing urgency, bringing remedies that grew more desperate in their intent. They attempted new incisions, hoping to drain what their instruments could no longer reach. But each intervention left Louis trembling, drenched in sweat, his breath shallow with shock. They applied compresses soaked in pungent herbs, hoping to draw out the heat that radiated from the wound. But the infection resisted their efforts with unyielding strength. His fever spiked, burning through him like a relentless fire, and when it briefly receded, it left him chilled and shaking, his skin cold to the touch, even beneath layers of blankets. The swelling had spread along his lower back and hips, creating a deep, throbbing ache that never truly subsided. The physicians whispered among themselves in corners, their faces pale, their voices tight with panic. And although they continued their treatments, they knew, as Louis did, that the infection had moved far beyond the reach of their crude tools. The nights grew longer, stretching into vast expanses of silence, interrupted only by the sound of Louis's unsteady breathing. He lay awake through most of them, staring at the canopy above his bed, tracking the patterns carved into the wood as though following a map to some place he would never reach. The infection pulsed in painful waves, making him twist and turn in small increments that sent jolts through his body. Sometimes he gasped, the sound sharp enough to bring attendants rushing to his side, and they would adjust his pillows, offer him water, or simply hold his hand until the worst passed. These gestures moved him more deeply than anything that had come before, and he found himself clinging to the warmth of their presence in a way he never would have allowed in earlier years. His mind wandered more frequently now, drifting through memories that surfaced without warning. He recalled moments of triumph, the grand opening of Versailles, the victories in war, the applause of courtiers who had treated him as a living embodiment of divine right. He remembered the laughter of loved ones long gone, the whispers of early ambition when he was still a young king shaping France with bold certainty. But the memories were not all triumphant. They came with shadows too, moments of regret, decisions made in anger, the weight of responsibilities he had carried alone. In these final days, he realized how deeply his life had been shaped by the relentless pursuit of power, and how sharply that pursuit now contrasted with the frailty of his body. He felt a sorrow he could not fully articulate, a longing for the strength that had once defined him, and an acceptance of the truth that no amount of authority could protect him from the inevitable. The monarchy had begun preparing for his passing even before the physicians admitted the end was near. His successor, a child still too young to grasp the magnitude of the crown he would inherit, waited in quiet chambers, guarded by anxious courtiers. And Louis thought often of him in these last days. He worried about the fragility of France, about the ambitions of ministers who might exploit a young king's vulnerability, about the future of a nation that had been shaped so completely by his hand. These thoughts weighed on him more heavily than the fever, pressing against his heart like a reminder that the world he was leaving behind was no longer under his control. Yet even as he worried, a strange calmness settled over him, because he understood now that legacies were not built in the final hours of life. They were forged over decades, in the shadows and triumphs of the past. As his strength continued to fade, the people closest to him gathered by his bedside in solemn shifts, their faces etched with grief. They held his hands, wiped his brow, whispered reassurances they hoped he could hear. Louis listened, his hearing dimmed by fever and exhaustion. And although he could no longer summon the voice of a king, he felt a profound gratitude for the compassion he was shown. He had spent a lifetime commanding obedience. But now, in the final hours, he was surrounded not by subjects, but by human beings who mourned him. The distinction mattered more to him than he expected. On the last morning of his life, the light filtered weakly through the curtains, casting a pale glow across his chamber. Louis drifted in and out of consciousness, too weak to move, too tired to fight the infection that had ravaged his body. His breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, each one sounding like a fragile thread being stretched to its limit. The attendants stood nearby, their eyes fixed on him, aware that the king who had shaped their lives was nearing the end of his. When he finally exhaled his last breath, it left his body like a soft sigh, dissolving into the stillness of the room. Versailles fell silent. The courtiers who had built their identities around his presence stood stunned in their chambers, listening to the news travel through the palace like a cold wind. Outside, the gardens remained serene, unaware that the monarch who had shaped them with such precision had left the world, and the France he had ruled for more than 70 years shifted instantly into a new era, one defined not by the blaze of a king's ambition, but by the shadow of his absence. Louis the Fourteenth's death marked more than the end of a life. It marked the closing of an era. His reign had been vast, brilliant, contentious, magnificent, flawed, and unforgettable. But in the end, the king who had seemed able to command everything had been brought down by a wound no one could see. An infection that revealed the truth he had resisted his entire life, that even the brightest sun must eventually set.